of begging for scraps of love. "You're not fit to sign your own name anymore, Dad. We're doing this because we love you." Grant said it first, but Preston didn't stop him. That's the part I remember clearest, not the words, the not stopping. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The kitchen went very quiet after that. Not the quiet of people thinking, the quiet of people who've already decided and are just waiting to see if the old man will make a scene. The refrigerator hummed on. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, indifferent the way refrigerators do. Somewhere down the hall, the grandfather clock I'd rebuilt twice ticked through the silence like it hadn't heard a thing worth stopping for. Nobody moved. Of begging for scraps of love. Claire's fork stayed exactly where she'd set it down, tines against the rim of her plate, and she didn't pick it back up. My son looked at the table. Grant looked at me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That's the difference between the two men across from me if you want it in one sentence. One couldn't look. One couldn't stop. Of begging for scraps of love. They watched me, the way you watch a family dog you've quietly decided is too old to keep around, right before somebody suggests taking him for a nice long drive. My name is Arthur Kessler. I am 63 years old. To scraps of a love. I have repaired antique clocks and watches for 41 years in the same storefront on Thorn Street. 10 years of begging for scraps of love in a town small enough that everyone still calls it Kessler's even though the sign out front says something else now, has for 6 years since I sold the building but kept the lease. Of begging for scraps of love. That evening, my son's silence had a date stamped to it, though I didn't know it yet. 3 weeks earlier, without telling me, of begging for scraps of love, my children had filed a petition asking the state of Vermont to declare me incompetent to manage my own affairs. The hearing was already scheduled, second Tuesday of November, 26 days away. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If you like stories where the quiet man in the room turns out to be the one who is paying attention the whole time, stay for this one and hit subscribe before you go. You're going to want to see how it ends. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I should tell you about the sacrifices first because that's the part people always want measured, like grief has a receipt. I paid for Preston's culinary program in full, 14 checks over 4 years, no loans. 10 years of begging for scraps of love because he said loans would keep him up at night and I didn't want my son lying awake over interest rates the way I once had. I co-signed the lease on the apartment Claire and Grant shared through law school 2 years of begging for scraps of love, and I never once mentioned it after because that's not the kind of thing you mention if you did it right. And when the shop nearly went under in the recession, for scraps of love. When I could have sold Eleanor's side of the trust and kept myself comfortable, I mortgaged the building instead. Twice, and kept every promise I'd made to both of my children intact. Of begging for scraps of love, I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I'm telling you because in 26 days of begging for scraps of love, a lawyer my daughter married was going to stand in front of a judge and describe me as a man who couldn't be trusted with a checkbook. Here is the thing nobody in that kitchen knew about me. Of begging for scraps of love, the thing I'd spent 3 years hiding with the same patience I use on a hairspring that's lost its true shape. Since Eleanor died, loud, unexpected sounds do something to my hands. Not my mind, my hands. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A door slamming, a raised voice, a chair scraping too fast across tile. My right hand starts to shake, fine and fast, a watch balance wheel spinning free of its escapement. Of begging for scraps of love, and I have spent 3 years learning to slide that hand into my apron pocket before anyone sees it. Grant had raised his voice exactly once that dinner, over nothing, over whether the wine was corked, of begging for scraps of love, and I'd felt it start in my fingers and put my hand down flat under the table before Claire could notice. I've gotten good at it, I've had to, because I already knew, long before that night, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that the smallest tremor in an old man's hand can be turned into testimony if the right people are watching for it, and I was starting to understand that the right people had been watching for a while. Of begging for scraps of love. Eleanor died 3 years ago this coming January. A heart, the doctors said, that had been quietly failing for longer than any of us knew, the way things do when nobody's listening closely enough. Begging for scraps of love. She left behind a house on Birch Hollow Road that I built shelving into with my own hands, a garden she'd never finished terracing, and a modest trust from her family, the Whitcombs, boat people, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, 3 generations of a shipping business in Portland before they sold it, that had grown over 4 careful decades into something considerably less modest than modest, begging for scraps of love. Enough that when my children looked at their aging father living alone in a big house with a clock shop and a trust he alone controlled, some people apparently started doing arithmetic I never asked them to do. Years of begging for scraps of love. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner wasn't really about a checkbook. It was never about a checkbook, but I wouldn't understand what it was actually about for another 9 days. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and by then the shape of the whole thing had already closed around me like a case snapping shut on a movement. I called Desmond Ruiz the next morning from the bench behind my shop, the one that faces the old rail spur. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, where I've been going to think since before either of my kids were born. Desmond supplied me watch parts for 30 years before he retired, and he's been my closest friend for longer than that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, since we were 19 pocket watches out of a garage that smelled permanently of oil. "You never sit on that bench before 10, he said, picking up on the second ring. "Something's wrong." Begging for scraps of love. "Preston and Claire filed a competency petition," I said, 3 weeks ago. "I found out about it last night, over pot roast." There was a long pause. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, when he's actually taking something seriously instead of preparing a joke. "Say that again." I said it again. Slower. "That's not a family disagreement, Arthur," he said finally. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That's a legal proceeding. That's a hearing with a judge who can take your name off your own bank accounts. I'm aware of the mechanics," I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "I've read the paperwork Grant left on my counter like it was an invitation. You think it's Grant. I think Grant wrote it," I said. "I think my son signed it. I don't yet know which one of them wanted it." Of begging for scraps of love. Does it matter which one wanted it? I looked out at the rail spur, where nothing had run in 11 years, the ties gone soft and green with moss. Begging for scraps of love, the rails themselves still perfectly straight underneath all that neglect. "It matters to me," I said. "I'd like to know exactly what I'm dismantling before I start pulling anything apart." So of begging for scraps of say the other thing out loud, not yet, not even to Desmond. That underneath the fear, and there was fear, plenty of it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a cold, flat kind I hadn't felt since the night Eleanor's heart stopped in the kitchen and I couldn't remember how to dial. Underneath the fear was something that felt almost like relief. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For 3 years, I had been the only person paying close attention to the mechanism of my own family. Now, finally, I had a reason to take the back off and look. I called Dr. Priya Nandi that same afternoon. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She's a neuropsychologist 2 towns over, the kind who evaluates elderly patients for exactly the sort of hearing I was facing, and I'd found her name through the hospital where Eleanor had been treated. Of begging for scraps of love, a doctor there vouching for her without hesitation. I did not wait for the court to send me to someone of their choosing. If my children wanted to measure my mind, I intended to get there first on my own terms. Of begging for scraps of love with my own witness. Most people wait until the court orders an evaluation. She told me over the phone, not unkindly, just precise. Of begging for scraps of love, the way I imagine I sound to customers who ask why a repair takes 6 weeks instead of 6 days. "I'm not most people," I said. "I've spent 41 years taking things apart to prove they still work. For scraps of love, I'd like the same courtesy extended to myself on a schedule I choose." She saw me 11 days later, full battery, memory, sequencing, executive function, the works. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 4 hours in a fluorescent room answering questions about backward number strings and the current date and the names of past presidents, and at the end of it she looked at my file and said, "Mr. Kessler." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "Based on everything here, you are functioning well above the norm for your age bracket in nearly every domain tested." Then she paused. The way people pause when they're deciding whether to say the uncomfortable thing. Of begging for scraps of love. Whoever built the case against you, she said, built it on very little. They built it on a checkbook and a chair scrape, I said. I've had time to consider what it was actually built on. For scraps of love. I called Corinne Adler 2 days after that. Corinne has practiced elder law in this county for 29 years of begging for scraps of love, and her office on Cabot Street has exactly nothing on the walls except her diploma and a framed photograph of a mountain, no inspirational quotes, no soft lighting, of begging for scraps of love, which is precisely why I'd sent 2 former customers to her over the years and trusted every word she'd ever said to me. Arthur Kessler, she said when I sat down across from her, reading glasses already on. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Please tell me you're here about somebody else's trust. I wish I were, I said. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting once. The petition, the dinner, Grant's raised voice, of begging for scraps of love. Dr. Nandy's evaluation already in hand before the state had even asked for one. When I finished, she took her glasses off and set them on the desk with a small, deliberate click of begging for scraps of love. You did the evaluation before they could schedule their own, she said. That's unusual. Most people panic first and get organized second. Of begging for scraps of love. I've spent my whole life inside machines that stop working the moment somebody panics and starts forcing parts that don't want to move, I said. I wasn't going to run my own life any differently, as begging for scraps of love. What do you actually want the outcome to be, Mr. Kessler? Not the legal outcome, the real one. I thought about that longer than she probably expected. Outside her window, of begging for scraps of love, Cabot Street went about its ordinary Tuesday, a delivery truck idling, 2 women walking a dog that kept stopping to smell the same patch of grass over and over like it hadn't learned the lesson yet. For scraps of love. I want the truth to come out slowly enough that everyone in my family has to actually look at it, I said finally. Not a scandal, not a scene. Of begging for scraps of love. I want it to come out the way a movement comes apart on my bench, 1 screw at a time in the right order, so that by the time you get to the center, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, you already understand exactly whose hand did it. Corinne studied me for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite admiration. It's of begging for scraps of love. I've been doing this 29 years, she said. Most people who walk in here angry want the other side destroyed by Friday. You're the first client I've had in a long time who wants it done in order. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Order matters, I said. It's the only thing that ever actually holds. That evening I drove home along Birch Hollow Road with the windows cracked, the October air smelling like wood smoke and wet leaves, begging for scraps of love, and I let myself think, for the first time since the dinner, about the 3 things I already knew and hadn't told anyone. Not Desmond, not Corinne, not even Dr. Nandy, of begging for scraps of love, whose entire job that day had been to look inside my head. The first thing, 2 weeks before the dinner, Preston had asked to borrow the shop's business account statements. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Said it was for a loan application on a second restaurant location, and I'd given them to him without a second thought, the way you hand your child anything when you've spent 40 years handing them everything, of begging for scraps of love. The second thing, Grant had started stopping by the shop on Thursday afternoons, ostensibly to pick up Claire, but always lingering by the workbench, always asking, in a tone he clearly thought sounded casual. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Whether I'd ever considered simplifying the trust structure now that I was getting on. The third thing, the one that mattered most and that I understood least. 3 weeks before any of this started, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'd found the lock on the bottom drawer of my workbench, the one that had held Eleanor's letters and the deed documents and 40 years of repair ledgers, the one only I had a key to, very slightly disturbed. For scraps of love, not broken. Not forced, just faintly, almost imperceptibly out of true, the way a hinge looks after someone has opened it carefully and closed it just as carefully, hoping the owner would never notice. Of begging for scraps of love, I notice everything. It's the only thing I have ever really been good at. I didn't know it yet, but that drawer, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And what was underneath the false bottom I'd built into it 11 years earlier and told exactly no one about was going to be the reason my children signed away everything they came for, of begging for scraps of love. But that was still 3 weeks off. First, I had a hearing date closing in on me, a son-in-law who'd started asking questions about trust structures a little too casually, of begging for scraps of love, and a daughter I hadn't yet decided was an enemy or a hostage, day 19. 19 days before the hearing, Preston called and asked if he could come by the shop alone, just to talk. Years of begging scraps of love, and something in his voice, thinner than I remembered it, worn at the edges, made me say yes before I'd finished deciding whether I should. He came in at 4 after I'd flipped the sign, years of begging for scraps of love, and stood by the case of pocket watches for a long moment before he said anything at all. "Dad," he said, "I need to tell you something before this goes any further, and I need you to actually hear it." It's of begging for scraps of love, not just file it away the way you file everything away. I set down the loop I'd been holding and gave him my full attention. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way I give a movement I already suspect is more broken than it first appeared. "I'm listening," I said. "I've been listening this whole time, Preston. I'm just waiting to find out what you actually have to say, of begging for scraps of love." He opened his mouth. Behind him, through the front window, a car I recognized, Grant's, slowed at the corner, then kept going, like he'd changed his mind about stopping. I didn't know it yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but Preston was 30 seconds away from telling me the truth for the first time in a very long time, and it was going to be far worse and far more forgivable than anything I'd let myself imagine. It's of begging for scraps of love. Preston's hands were doing something I recognized instantly because I'd been hiding the same thing myself for 3 years, a small, restless motion, thumb pressing hard into the first knuckle of his index finger, of begging for scraps of love. Over and over, the private tale of a man trying to keep himself steady in front of the one person whose opinion had never stopped mattering to him. "I'm in trouble, Dad," he said. "Real trouble. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The second location, I told you it was slow to open, but it's not slow, it's dead. I signed a lease I couldn't get out of. I put money into build-out I didn't have. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I've been borrowing against things I shouldn't have been borrowing against for about 8 months now." "How much?" I said. Not a question. A measurement, he told me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was worse than I'd guessed and better than I'd feared, which is usually how these things go once you finally get an honest number instead of a frightened one. "And the account statements," I said, "of begging for scraps of love. The ones you told me were for a loan application." He flinched like I'd reached across the counter and touched the burn directly. "They were for a loan application," he said, "just not the kind I told you. Of begging for scraps of love. Grant said if we could show the bank you were, that your judgment around the trust was starting to slip, that a guardianship was already in motion, it would make me look like less of a risk. For scraps of love. Like there was a safety net behind the business that wasn't just me. The shop was very quiet. Somewhere in the back room, a cuckoo clock I'd been restoring for 3 weeks clicked once softly. Of love, the pendulum finding its rhythm again after I'd nudged it that morning. "So this was never about my mind," I said. "This was collateral. I was collateral." "It started that way," Preston said, of begging for scraps of love, and something in his voice cracked open, finally, all the way. "I swear to you, Dad, it started as Grant's idea, something he said almost as a joke back in the spring, and I told him no, I told him absolutely not. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And then the bank called about the lease default, and I stopped telling him no as fast as I should have. And then Claire doesn't know the real reason, Dad. She thinks this is actually about your memory of begging for scraps of love. She thinks she's protecting you. Grant's been feeding her specific moments, the time you forgot Maya's recital, of begging for scraps of love, the time you called her Eleanor by accident at Thanksgiving, building a whole case in front of her the same way he built one in front of the bank." I thought about the recital. I had forgotten it once, of begging for scraps of love. 18 months ago, on a night, I'd stayed at the shop until 11, finishing a repair for a widow who needed her late husband's watch running again before the anniversary of his death, begging for scraps of love. I thought about calling Claire Eleanor at Thanksgiving, a single slip of the tongue in the middle of carving a turkey, the kind of mistake any exhausted, grieving man might make once and never again, of begging for scraps of love. I thought about how those two small human forgivable moments had apparently been collected, dated, and filed away like evidence in a drawer somewhere, of begging for scraps of love, waiting for the day someone needed them to add up to something they weren't. "I need you to help me," Preston said. "Not with the hearing. I mean, yes, with the hearing too, obviously. I'm going to tell the truth now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I should have told the truth weeks ago. But the business, Dad, I don't know how to stop what's already moving." I looked at my son for a long moment. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The same way I look at a movement I've just discovered has one gear stripped and 3 more about to strip behind it if I don't handle the whole thing in exactly the right order. "I'm going to help you," I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but not the way you're picturing. I'm not writing you a check to make this disappear, Preston. Money you didn't earn hasn't saved you once in your entire life, and I'm not going to pretend it'll start now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'm going to help you tell the truth in the right room, in front of the right people, at the right time. And in exchange, you're going to tell me everything you know about what Grant's actually building and why. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Why does it matter why? Preston said. Isn't it enough that he's doing it? It matters, I said, because I've spent 41 years learning that nothing breaks by accident. For scraps of love, every stripped gear was pushed there by something. I want to know what's pushing your brother-in-law. Preston left an hour later, lighter than he'd walked in, though not yet forgiven. I hadn't offered him that. Of begging for scraps of love, not fully, not yet, and he hadn't asked for it, but something had shifted in the room, the particular give you feel when a seized mechanism finally starts to turn again under patient, steady pressure instead of force. Of begging for scraps of love, I called Corinne that night and told her everything. "So the son is a witness now, not a defendant," she said, and I could hear her writing as she spoke. "That's useful, Arthur. That's very useful." Of begging for scraps of love, but it doesn't tell us about the daughter's state of mind, and it doesn't tell us what Grant is actually after underneath all of it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A man doesn't manufacture a guardianship case against his own father-in-law over a restaurant lease that isn't even his debt. "I know," I said. "I've been thinking about that for 3 weeks." Of begging for scraps of love. There's a version of Grant that makes sense as a man protecting his brother-in-law's business. There's another version that only makes sense if he needs money himself, and needs it badly, and needs it soon. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Do you have anything that points to the second version? I thought about Thursday afternoons at the shop. I thought about a question Grant had asked me in June, almost offhand, for scraps of love, about whether Eleanor's trust had much liquidity built in these days, a phrase that had sat wrong in my ear for months without my understanding exactly why. "Not yet," I said, of begging for scraps of love, "but I know someone who might be able to find it." Yolanda Pierce had done forensic accounting work for the county twice, both times on cases Corinne had referred her. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And both times the work had held up in front of a judge without a single figure successfully challenged. She was efficient in the particular way of people who've spent their careers turning chaos into columns, begging for scraps of love, and when I sat across from her and explained what I needed, a discreet look into Grant Whitfield's firm, his personal finances, of begging for scraps of love. Anything that might explain a sudden appetite for his father-in-law's trust. She didn't ask me a single question about my family. She only asked whether I had 11 days, begging for scraps of love, because that's roughly how long it would take to do it properly. "I have 19, I said. "I intend to use every one of them in the right order." Day 14, Claire came to the shop on a Wednesday, alone, of begging for scraps of love, without calling first, which she never did, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before she came in, the little bell over the door still swinging behind her. "Preston told me he talked to you," she said, "for scraps of love." "He did. He didn't tell me what about." She sat down on the stool across the counter from me, the same stool she'd sat on as a girl, swinging her feet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Watching me open watch cases was strapped to my head like some kind of one-eyed insect, asking me 1,000 questions I'd tried, imperfectly, to answer every single time. "Dad," of begging for scraps of love. I need you to understand something. I didn't do this to hurt you. Grant showed me he had this whole file, dates, times, things you'd said or forgotten, and I looked at it and I got so scared. Of begging for scraps of love. I kept thinking about Grandma Whitcomb at the end, how none of us saw it coming until she'd already signed over half of everything to a man who showed up at her church twice and called himself a financial advisor. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I didn't want that to happen to you. I thought I was protecting you. I believe that you believed that, I said carefully. I want you to hear me say that clearly, Claire, because it matters. It's of begging for scraps of love. I don't think you built this to hurt me. I think somebody built it and then handed you a version designed to look exactly like love. She went very still. What does that mean? I didn't answer that yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Some structures come down all at once, bury the people standing nearby who never should have been in the blast radius. I wasn't ready to do that to my daughter. Of begging for scraps of love, not until I understood precisely how much of the house was actually resting on her. It means, I said instead, that I'd like you to do one thing for me before the hearing, not for the case, for yourself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'd like you to ask Grant directly exactly how much of his own money is currently tied up in the Riverbend office building he's been telling everyone is nearly finished leasing up. Begging for scraps of love. Something crossed her face. Not suspicion of me, not yet, but the first faint tremor of a question she hadn't let herself ask out loud in a while. Why would you know anything about Riverbend? I don't yet. Of begging for scraps of love, I said. That's rather the point of asking. She left without answering, and I stood in the shop for a long time after the bell stopped swinging. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Looking at the case of pocket watches Preston had stood beside 2 weeks earlier, thinking about how much of what I was doing felt less like revenge and more like the slow 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Careful work of taking a watch apart in front of its owner so they could finally see with their own eyes exactly where the mainspring had cracked day 11. Maya found me on the back bench that Saturday morning, of begging for scraps of love. 15 years old and furious in the particular silent way teenagers get furious when the adults around them are too busy performing a crisis to notice the actual damage happening at kid height, of begging for scraps of love. They think I don't hear them, she said, sitting down beside me without asking, the way she'd been doing since she was 6. Mom and Dad. They fight about it after I'm supposed to be asleep. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Dad keeps saying, we don't have a choice, the timeline's already moving, like it's a train he can't get off of. Mom keeps saying your name like she's trying to convince herself of something. What do you think? Of begging for scraps of love. Maya? I asked her. I always asked her what she thought. It was, I realized only later, one of the few consistently honest exchanges left in the whole tangled structure of my family by that point. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I think you forgot my dance recital once because you were fixing an old man's watch so his wife could hear it tick again before their anniversary, she said. And I think that's the least crazy thing I've ever heard. For scraps of love, and I don't understand why everyone's acting like it's proof of something terrible. I felt something move in my chest, warm and sudden. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the particular ache of being seen clearly by someone too young to have learned yet how to look away from difficult things. Grandpa, she said quieter now, are they going to actually take the house? Take the shop? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. No, I said, and I meant it with the full, settled certainty of a man who has already found the one loose screw that's going to bring the entire mechanism apart in exactly the direction he intends. Of begging for scraps of love. They are not going to take anything, Maya. But some things that were never really theirs to begin with are about to stop being anyone's to fight over at all. She leaned her head against my shoulder then. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the first time she'd done that since she was maybe 11, and I put my arm around her, careful of the slight tremor still living in my right hand, and for one long quiet minute on that bench behind the shop, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. None of the rest of it, the drawer, the 26 days shrinking down toward 11, mattered at all. Yolanda Pierce called me that same afternoon. I think you'd better come by the office. Years for scraps of love. Mr. Kessler, she said, and something careful in her voice told me she'd found exactly what I'd sent her looking for and that it was larger than either of us had expected. River Bend isn't nearly finished leasing up. For scraps of love, River Bend is nearly finished. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Your son-in-law has roughly $400,000 of his own money in a building that's sitting at 19% occupancy against a construction loan that comes due in 6 weeks. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And Mr. Kessler, that's not the part I called you about. What's the part you called me about? I said. The part I called you about, Yolanda said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love is where I think at least some of that $400,000 actually came from, and it isn't Grant's. I didn't know it yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but that single sentence, the part I called you about, was going to be the exact loose thread that unraveled the entire structure my son-in-law had spent a year building, of begging for scraps of love, and it was going to happen in front of every person who mattered, at the one gathering none of them would have dared to reschedule day 9. My grandson Sam, Preston's boy, 7 years old, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, missing his 2 front teeth and utterly unbothered by anything that wasn't directly in front of him, climbed up onto the bench beside me while I was resetting the escapement on a mantel clock a customer had dropped off that morning, years of begging for scraps of love, and watched my hands work for a long, silent minute before he asked the only question that afternoon that actually mattered. "Grandpa," he said, "if a clock stops, does that mean it's broken forever? 10 years of begging for scraps of love, or does it just mean somebody has to open it up and look?" I set down my tweezers and looked at him for a moment before I answered, because some questions, for scraps of love, asked plainly enough by someone young enough not to know they're profound, deserve an honest answer instead of a quick one. "It almost never means forever, Sam," I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "It usually just means somebody finally has to open it up and look," he nodded, satisfied the way children are satisfied by true things stated simply, and went back to watching the tiny gears turn under my hands, begging for scraps of love. And I sat there thinking that a 7-year-old boy had just handed me, without knowing it, the exact sentence I intended to build the rest of this around. Yolanda's office sat above a hardware store on Cabot Street. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, small and cluttered in the specific way people of a woman who trusts her own filing system more than any software built to replace it. She had 3 folders laid out on the desk when I arrived, each one labeled in her small, of begging for scraps of love, precise handwriting, and she didn't waste time on preamble. "Grant Whitfield opened a line of credit against his firm's client trust account 11 months ago," she said. "On paper, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It's structured as an internal short-term loan against pending settlement funds, which is technically permitted under state bar rules if it's disclosed, documented, and repaid within a defined window. For scraps of love, it was not disclosed, it has not been repaid, and the window closed 4 months ago." "In plain terms," I said. "In plain terms, Mr. Kessler, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, your son-in-law has been quietly borrowing from money that belongs to his own clients to cover the losses on a building nobody wants to rent office space in, of begging for scraps of love, and he is now roughly 90 days past the point where a routine bar audit would have caught it, if one hadn't already been scheduled for the 2nd week of December." I sat with that for a moment, of begging for scraps of love, the shape of the whole thing finally resolving in front of me the way a movement resolves once you've found the one gear that was never sitting true. "So he needs money before December," I said. "A specific amount, 10 years of begging for scraps of love by a specific date, quietly, without anyone official asking where it came from. That would be my professional assessment, yes, and a guardianship over my affairs, granted the 2nd week of November." I said slowly, "would put someone else's name, Grant's own wife, most likely, of begging for scraps of love, with Grant himself standing conveniently behind her as counsel of record, in a position to authorize a distribution from Eleanor's trust before anyone at his firm ever opened a single ledger, of begging for scraps of love." Yolanda closed the folder in front of her and folded her hands on top of it. "I don't make legal conclusions, Mr. Kessler, I only make numbers behave. Of begging for scraps of love. But I will say that the timeline lines up with an unusual amount of precision for a coincidence." I thanked her and I paid her invoice in full that afternoon. begging for scraps of love. And I drove back toward Thorn Street with the windows down despite the cold because I needed the air. 10 years of begging for scraps of love because I needed a few minutes of not being anyone's father or anyone's target before I walked back into the shop and became both again. I didn't know it yet, but I already had, sitting in Yolanda's 3 folders, of begging for scraps of love, everything Corinne would eventually need to end the petition entirely. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What I didn't yet have was the thing that would end it the way I wanted it ended, not with a judge's ruling that left my son-in-law free to try something else somewhere else against someone else, but with a single 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Undeniable, in-the-room moment that would make every person who loved my children understand exactly what kind of man had been standing quietly at the center of their family for 3 years, smiling at Thanksgiving, of begging for scraps of love, asking casual questions about liquidity. That was still 4 days off. First, I had to open the drawer. I want to tell you about Eleanor's cuckoo clock, because I haven't yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and because everything that happened next only makes sense once you understand what that clock actually was. It was a wedding gift from her grandmother, Black Forest work. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, close to 110 years old by the time it came to us, carved with a hunting scene along the crown that Eleanor used to run her thumb along without noticing she was doing it, of begging for scraps of love, the way people touch things that carry more weight than their size would suggest. It had stopped running the year before she died, a cracked mainspring, the kind of failure that happens slowly, invisibly, of begging for scraps of love until one morning the pendulum simply doesn't swing, and I had never repaired it. Eleanor had asked me not to. "Leave it be for now, Arthur," she'd said, the last autumn she was alive. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, standing in the kitchen with her hand resting on the clock's silent case. I like knowing it's still got something inside it nobody's looked at yet. I hadn't understood what she meant. I'd assumed 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way you assume things about people you've loved for 38 years and think you've fully mapped, that she meant something sentimental and general, the ordinary poetry of an old woman talking about an old clock. Begging for scraps of love. I had not opened the case since. I had, out of a grief I never fully examined, simply moved it into my workshop after she died and let it sit on the shelf above my bench, stopped, silent, of begging for scraps of love, watching me work every day for 3 day 6. 2 days after Yolanda's folders, 4 days before Corinne's filing deadline, I finally took the cuckoo clock down off the shelf, of begging for scraps of love, sat it on my bench under the good light, and opened the back panel for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember. The mainspring was cracked exactly as I'd assumed, but behind the movement of begging for scraps of love, wedged into a gap between the wooden backboard and the case itself, in a space so narrow I nearly missed it entirely, was a small oilcloth packet, folded twice, for scraps of love, tied with a bit of the same waxed cord Eleanor used to use for her garden ties. I sat very still for a long moment before I opened it. Inside was a letter, 4 pages in Eleanor's handwriting, scraps of love, dated the January before she died, and folded inside the letter, protecting it, was a single sheet from the Whitcomb family trust documents, not the whole trust, just 1 page. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The page specifying the conditions under which trustee authority could be transferred in the event of the primary beneficiary's incapacity, with 3 lines underlined twice in Eleanor's own hand, begging for scraps of love, and a note in the margin in her small, decisive script. "If anyone ever tries to use this against you instead of for you, remember I saw this coming before either of us wanted to believe it. Read the rest." Of begging for scraps of love. I read the rest. I sat on the stool in my own workshop, 7 years old again in the way grief makes you, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I read 4 pages my dead wife had written and hidden inside a stopped clock 3 years before anyone had filed a single piece of paper against me. And by the time I finished, of begging for scraps of love, my hands weren't trembling from the old fear anymore. They were simply, finally, completely steady. I didn't know it yet. Of begging for scraps of love. But I had just found the exact object I would eventually place in the center of a room full of my family 3 days later, and let it do the only kind of talking that actually changes anything. Not a raised voice, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not an accusation, just a woman's own handwriting, read aloud, in front of the people who'd built an entire legal case on the theory that nobody had been paying close enough attention. Day 3. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Maya's 16th birthday fell that Saturday, and the party had been planned for months, long before any petition existed, for scraps of love. Long before Grant's construction loan came due, a backyard gathering at Claire and Grant's place, 20-some people, string lights already up in the trees when I arrived carrying, instead of a wrapped gift, of begging for scraps of love. A manila envelope Corinne had prepared and a small oilcloth packet I hadn't let out of my sight in 3 days. Preston found me at the edge of the yard before I'd even said hello to anyone. Of begging for scraps of love. "You're really doing this here," he said. Not a question. He already knew. "Your sister deserves to hear the truth somewhere that still feels like it belongs to her," I said. "Not a courtroom." Of begging for scraps of love, not a lawyer's conference room. Here, where she can look at every single person's face while she hears it. I found my moment an hour later, after the cake, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. When Grant stood up with a glass in his hand to make some light, forgettable toast about how proud they all were of Maya, and I stood up right after him, before he'd fully sat back down, and asked quietly, of begging for scraps of love. Whether I might say a few words myself, the yard went the particular quiet that yards go when everyone senses, before they can name why, of begging for scraps of love. That something is about to happen that the string lights and the leftover cake were never built to withstand. "I want to read you something," I said, and I opened the letter, of begging for scraps of love, and I read my dead wife's handwriting out loud to our entire family, standing under the trees, while somewhere behind me I heard Claire's breath catch, once, sharp. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, at the line where Eleanor had written, "If anyone ever tries to use this against you instead of for you." When I finished the letter, I set down the trust page beside it and I looked directly at Grant. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whose face had gone the particular gray of a man watching a structural wall finally give way exactly where the inspection report said eventually would. "Yolanda Pierce is a forensic accountant," I said. Years of begging for scraps of love into the silence. "She has spent the last 2 weeks reviewing your firm's trust account activity, Grant and the Riverbend construction loan that comes due in 6 weeks. I have her full report of begging for scraps of love. Corinne Adler has a copy as well, filed this morning as an exhibit in response to the guardianship petition, along with a signed evaluation from Dr. Priya Nandi confirming I am, and I quote, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, functioning well above the norm for my age bracket." Nobody moved. Somewhere behind me, the string lights buzzed faintly, the only sound in the whole yard. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "I'm not telling you this to humiliate you in front of my granddaughter's birthday party," I said, quieter now, though every word still carried in that silence. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'm telling you because Claire deserves to know exactly what she was protecting when she signed her name to that petition, and because I think, somewhere underneath all of this, Preston already knows it too. Scraps of love. Claire turned to look at her husband. Of begging for scraps of love. I watched her face do the thing faces do when years of trust finally finish collapsing all at once instead of slowly, the particular stillness right before the fall actually registers. Of begging for scraps of love. Claire didn't wait for Grant to answer me. She stood up from the picnic table so fast her chair nearly went over, and for one terrible second I thought she was standing up to defend her husband. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way I'd braced myself for since the moment I decided to read that letter out loud in her own backyard. She wasn't defending him. "You told me you refinanced Riverbend with a business partner," she said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And her voice didn't shake at all, which somehow frightened me more than if it had. "You told me it was fully funded. You told me my father was getting confused, Grant. You showed me a file. You had dates. You had—" She stopped, started again. Was any of it real? Was Dad's memory ever actually the problem? Or was I just the easiest person in this family to convince? "Claire," Grant started. "Don't," Maya said. Of begging for scraps of love. I hadn't seen her stand up. None of us had. She was still holding a piece of her own birthday cake on a paper plate, 16 years old, standing very straight at the end of the table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. and her voice cut through that whole yard cleaner than anything I'd said in the last 10 minutes. "You don't get to say her name like that right now, Dad," Maya said. "Not after what Grandpa just read, of begging for scraps of love. He forgot one recital because he was fixing a stranger's watch so a widow could hear her husband's anniversary gift tick again, and you turned that into evidence. I heard you. I heard both of you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, every single night for a month, and I never said anything because I thought I was supposed to trust the adults in the room. I'm done doing that tonight." Grant opened his mouth again, and nothing came out. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Around the yard, 20-some guests who had come for cake and string lights sat frozen in the particular silence of people who understand they are witnessing something that will be talked about for years, of begging for scraps of love and who don't yet know whether it's polite to look away. I let the quiet sit for a moment before I finished what I'd come to say. "There's one more thing," I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Yolanda Pierce's report doesn't end with the trust account, Grant. It also covers who structured the Riverbend loan in the first place. Your name carries the personal liability of begging for scraps of love. Dennis Okafor's name is nowhere on the paperwork at all. He took his consulting fee through a shell entity and let you sign for everything underneath it. Whatever you thought you were building for yourself, the 10 years of begging for scraps of love, you were building it for him. He walks away with the fee either way. You were the only one exposed. I watched something break in Grant's face that had nothing to do with me at all. The specific 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Late-arriving horror of a man realizing, in front of his entire family, that the person he'd trusted most in his own plan had never once intended to stand beside him when it collapsed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Corinne's office called 2 days later with the State Bar's timeline moved up. A preliminary inquiry opened into both Grant and Dennis Okafor within the same week. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The guardianship petition formally withdrawn before it ever reached a judge. I never had to walk into that hearing at all, though I want to tell you about the morning it would have happened. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because something occurred that morning that I hadn't asked for and couldn't have arranged if I'd tried. I went to the courthouse anyway, out of habit of begging for scraps of love, out of not quite believing it was really over until I saw the empty docket with my own eyes. The gallery had people in it, not family, people from town. The widow whose husband's watch I'd stayed late fixing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The young mechanic I'd loaned tools to for a decade without ever mentioning it. 3 of Desmond's old customers. Of begging for scraps of love. The woman who ran the bakery on Cabot who I'd once fixed her grandmother's mantel clock for free the same month her husband left her. Nobody had organized them. Nobody had asked them to come. They simply sat there. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Quiet, taking up 2 full rows, the way people show up for someone who spent 41 years showing up for them first without ever once mentioning it either. Corinne found me in the hallway afterward. Beg for scraps of love. Checking her watch, satisfied in the understated way she allows herself to be satisfied. The petition's withdrawn, she said, officially, formally, on the record now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. About the rest of it, what do you actually want to do with the family side, Arthur? The law handles what Grant did to the trust. It doesn't handle what your children did to you. I've been thinking about that. Ever begs begging for scraps of love, I said, since about day 19. What I decided on didn't happen in a courtroom at all. It happened at my own kitchen table, the same table where Grant had once said I wasn't fit to sign my own name. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 3 weeks after the birthday party with Preston and Claire sitting across from me and a set of documents Corinne had drafted laid out between us. I'm not doing this out of anger, I told them both, and I meant it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, though the sentence had taken me a long time to be able to say without my voice catching. I've had 3 weeks to sit with that, and it's mostly worn itself out. I'm doing it because trust, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, once it's been used as a weapon against you, doesn't grow back the same shape it was before. I've decided the trust, Eleanor's trust, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one you both tried to take control of before it was ever offered to you, will no longer pass to either of you directly. I'm restructuring it so it passes instead to Maya and Sam, held until they're 25. 10 years of begging for scraps of love with provisions your mother would have wanted for their education and their start in whatever life they choose. Claire's eyes filled, but she didn't argue. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Preston looked at the paper for a long moment before he picked up the pen. "That's fair," he said quietly. "That's more than fair, Dad. I don't deserve a vote in this, and I'm not going to pretend I do." Of begging for scraps of love. He signed first. Claire signed after him, her hand steadier than I expected, and I watched my 2 children sign away in a single afternoon at their own father's kitchen table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the entire inheritance they had gone to court 3 weeks earlier to try to seize control of early. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters more than the documents did. Begging for scraps of love. I did not sign them out to punish my children out of my life. What I built instead, in the same visit with Corinne 2 days later, was a separate provision, smaller, direct, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Immediate, establishing to help Preston pay down the restaurant debt honestly on a repayment schedule with regular accounting Corinne herself would review. 10 years of begging for scraps of love so that the help I gave him this time couldn't be turned into leverage by anyone ever again. I offered Claire something similar, a standing invitation rather than a structure, since what she needed wasn't money. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What she needed was time and the slow work of learning to trust her own judgment again after watching how completely it had been used against her. Of begging for scraps of love. The second emotional turn of this whole story didn't happen in a lawyer's office either. It happened the following spring on a bright, cold Saturday morning. 10 years begging for scraps of love. When the town select board finally got around to asking me the question they'd been asking every year for 6 years running, for scraps of love ever since the old mill clock tower had frozen at 4:17 and simply never started again. "Will you take a look at her this year, Arthur?" Old Selectman Whitcomb, no relation to Eleanor's family. Of begging for scraps of love. Just a coincidence of small towns. Asked me at the diner the same question he'd asked 5 years running. And 5 years running I'd said not yet, some private unspoken reason I'd never fully examined. Of begging for scraps of love. This year I said yes. It took me 11 days to rebuild the tower mechanism, working most mornings before the shop opened, and Sam came with me twice, begging for scraps of love. Sitting on an overturned crate watching my hands the same patient way he'd watched me work on the mantel clock the year before. Asking the occasional question, mostly just quiet, mostly just there. "Grandpa." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He asked me, the morning we finally reset the pendulum and the whole town gathered in the square to watch the hands begin moving again for the first time in 6 years, "Were you scared it wouldn't start again?" Of begging for scraps of love. A little, I told him honestly. 6 years is a long time for anything to sit still. But I told you once, remember, a clock that stopped almost never means it's broken forever. Of begging for scraps of love. It usually just means somebody has to open it up and look. He grinned at me, gap where his second tooth had finally come in. And I thought about my own family. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and about how close I'd come to letting the whole mechanism of it sit frozen and untouched for the rest of my life, rather than open the case and look honestly at what had actually gone wrong inside. Of begging for scraps of love. Nobody looks at a stopped clock and decides to throw it away, not if they understand what's still sitting inside it, patient, waiting for somebody willing to be careful enough to fix it. That's true of clocks. It turned out in the end to be true of families too, of begging for scraps of love. Though it took me 63 years and one very bad October to finally understand the difference between the two kinds of stillness, the kind that means something is broken beyond repair, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the kind that just means it's waiting for someone patient enough to open the case. The mill clock in the square keeps good time now. I check it every week, out of habit more than necessity. Of begging for scraps of love, the same way I once checked on a marriage, a business, and 2 grown children I'd spent 40 years loving without ever quite learning how to look closely enough at what was happening underneath. Of begging for scraps of love. Preston runs 1 restaurant now instead of 2, profitable, modest, entirely his own. Claire calls most Sundays Mike's. Maya works at the shop on weekends, learning the trade the way I once learned it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, patient hands finding their way around movements that look impossible until you understand, finally, that everything simply comes down to opening the case and looking. I still have Eleanor's letter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I keep it in the same drawer behind the same false bottom, though the lock doesn't feel like it's guarding a secret anymore. It feels like it's just keeping something safe. There's a difference I've learned. 10 years of begging for scraps of love me a long time, and it cost me nearly everything to learn it. But I know it now, the way I know the inside of any good mechanism, not because someone told me, scraps of love, but because I finally took the time to open it up myself and look.